Tyre Sampson. On March 24, 2022, 14-year-old Tyre Sampson took a trip with his football team to Icon Park in Orlando, USA. The boys decided to ride on the Orlando Freefall, the tallest freestanding drop tower in the world at 430 feet high. What started as just another day off ended up being a real tragedy. As the ride's movable part reached the top of the tower and began its descent, Tyre lost his grip and tumbled out of his seat, landing on the ground and died on the spot. The forensic expert report indicates that Sampson's death was primarily due to an error made by a park employee. It turns out that the operator of the free fall ride had loosened the safety belt on Sampson's seat. It probably happened when the ride was launched to ensure it could accommodate customers weighing over 287 pounds. The investigations found that Sampson's safety belt was nearly twice as loose as it should have been. The boy fell out of his seat during the ride because of this. After Sampson passed away, the Orlando Free Fall and the nearby Orlando Slingshot ride were shut down until they figured things out. Orlando Slingshot, the company behind the ride, announced that they would stop producing this model following the boy's tragic death. And Icon Park backed that decision. Ben Crump, a civil rights attorney representing Sampson's father, has called this decision long overdue. He said that theme parks, along with their parent companies and regulatory agencies, really needed to step up and make sure that no other family had to go through something like this. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time we've seen such a tragedy in the US. Rosy Esparza. Back in 2013, Rosy Esparza had a tragic experience on the Texas Giant roller coaster at Six Flags Over Texas amusement park. Before the ride started, she was worried about her safety belts. Once she hopped on the coaster, an operator reassured her that everything was securely in place. And then, the roller coaster began its wild ride. As the coaster took a sudden turn, Esparza's safety belt came undone, and she was launched 75 feet into the air, while her daughter watched in horror. They found her partially torn body wrapped around the hinge on the roof of the Honky Tonk Tunnel. Right after the incident, the police jumped into action with an investigation. Fast forward 2 months, and the ride was back up and running after they put in some restraints and new safety belts. Esparza's family has taken legal action against Six Flags and Gerstler, the company that makes the roller coasters. The park and Gerstler sued each other over who was responsible for the accident. In the end, both companies came to a private agreement with the victim's family. Accidents can happen anywhere, not just on fancy rides. Sometimes, you only need a simple net. James Hackemer. On July 9, 2011, James Hackemer, a veteran of the Iraq War, sadly lost his life on a roller coaster accident at Darien Lake Amusement Park in northern New York. Back in March 2008, 3 years earlier, Hackemer was in Iraq when his vehicle ran into a makeshift explosive device. The man ended up with a few injuries, and unfortunately, he had to have both legs amputated. When Hackemer said he wanted to go on a roller coaster ride at Darien Lake, the park employees couldn't fasten a safety belt on him. The man was placed in the first coach, and it was explained that he could hold on to the barrier in front of him with his hands. So, this guy didn't buckle up, and when the Ride of Steel coaster took a turn, he got thrown right out of his seat. The ride was zooming along at 50 miles per hour too. Hackemer was hanging out at the park with his kids and sister, but thankfully, his kids weren't there when the tragedy happened. Instead, Hackemer had his nephew, Ashton Lufred, with him. Ashton mentioned that the park employees were on board with the disabled veteran, wanting to ride the roller coaster, and didn't raise any questions. He was set on riding every roller coaster, his sister Jody Hackemer shared with the Associated Press. In that moment on the ride, he likely felt the happiest and most normal he's been in 3.5 years. State investigators found that a mistake by the operator was behind the tragedy, and the ride was up and running again later that same year. Sometimes, you don't even need a ticket for a roller coaster ride to get hurt. Just being close by can do the trick. Big Dipper. This next roller coaster accident turned out to be one of the deadliest one ever recorded. Carolyn Adamczyk will never forget the look of terror on that little girl's face just before she lost her life. A girl was among the kids who were killed in the tragedy at Battersea Park back on May 30th, 1972. Carolyn was just a 14-year-old schoolgirl when the disaster struck. The Big Dipper ride in South London had a tragic breakdown while it was running, resulting in the loss of 5 young lives. Carolyn was fortunate to make it through though. Wooden roller coasters are often seen as potentially dangerous rides. They tend to wear out fast and need regular upkeep. Just a tiny bit of carelessness can snowball into a huge problem. So, there we were, watching the train get lifted to kick off the ride, and suddenly, the haulage rope came loose from one of the carriages. Talk about a breakdown in the mechanism. A wooden train cruised over the park, carrying 31 passengers on board. Carolyn rolled over and saw the train operator trying to hit the brakes, but they weren't responding. Most of the train carriages didn't make the turn, and one jumped the rails, crashing right into a wooden fence. The train made a sudden turn and collided with another train that was waiting in the boarding area. Right after the crash, Carolyn and her friends were stuck in the carriage, hanging 50 feet above the ground. Sadly, 5 children lost their lives in the tragedy, and 13 others were seriously injured. The roller coaster never got fixed, and the Battersea Fun Fair shut down 2 years later. Luan Phi Dawson. So, on December 24th, 1998, a giant metal cleat came loose from the hull of a ride known as the sailing ship Columbia. On the way down, it struck 2 park visitors and 1 Disney employee. A visitor named Luan Phi Dawson, who was 33 years old and had suffered a head injury in an accident, unfortunately lost his life later in the emergency room. This was the first time someone died on a Disneyland ride, and it wasn't the visitor's fault. Luan suffered 2 severe head injuries and had no damage to a major blood vessel in his brain. His wife Luong had some head trauma too, but she made it through. Mrs. Wong had some plastic surgery to stitch up the cuts on the right side of her face. Christine Carpenter, who works at Disneyland, suffered a severe leg injury but got the proper treatment at the hospital. It turns out during a closer look, the strap meant to keep the metal cleats secure was swapped out for a rope made from the wrong material, all to cut costs. Besides that, the ship came into the dock too quickly, and the rope they used instead of a strap didn't have the strength to slow it down. The park management, not the ride operator, was found responsible for the accident. The victim's family received about $25 million in court. The Columbia ride is still not in operation today. Roller coasters are known for their extraordinary heights, and while that's what makes them thrilling, it also adds an element of danger. LeeShawn Ferguson. Back in 2015, there was a tragic incident where a teenager lost his life on a roller coaster. He had jumped over some fences and ended up in a restricted area, which led to the unfortunate event. There was a terrible accident at the Six Flags Over Georgia Park. 17-year-old LeeShawn Ferguson from Springfield managed to climb over 2 fences that were each 6.5 feet tall, completely disregarding the signs that warned about the dangerous forbidden zone ahead. It seemed like the boy was probably just trying to grab his hat that flew off while he was on the ride. But then again, some people say he might have been trying to prank the passengers by reaching for someone's foot as the coach went over him. The boy got struck right after he crawled under the roller coaster. A passenger's foot, while sitting in a coach going 50 miles per hour, accidentally hit the boy on the head. That hit took his head clean off. The police said that the boy's death was an accident. Six Flags chose to honor the Ferguson family by shutting the roller coaster on the day of the tragedy. However, the next day, the coaster was back in action, giving rides to cheerful park visitors. Lindsay Zeno. So, on July 11, 2010, a 21-year-old named Lindsay Zeno checked out Blue Bayou Water Park. Zeno hopped on a ride called Extreme Coaster, which had been thrilling riders for about 3 years now. Just a few minutes into her ride, the girl fell from a height of 30 feet and sadly lost her life due to the injury she sustained. We weren't sure what led to the accident. It might have been because of the faulty safety belt mechanism. A witness said they saw Zeno trying to fasten her safety belt just as the coaster took a sharp turn, sending her flying into the air. Butch Browning, the Louisiana State Fire Marshal, sent some inspectors from his department to take a look at the roller coaster. He said that all the mechanical parts of the coaster were in their proper place and working perfectly. But after the accident, they ended up closing the ride for good. Lori Mason-Larez. So, back on September 21st, 2001, this private party was at Knott's Berry Farm in Buena Park, California. Lori Mason-Larez, who was 40 then, got invited along with her 4 older kids by her sister. Lori's youngest, her 5th child, stayed home with her husband, who was dealing with a severe illness and needed a liver transplant. Lori decided to take the kids to the park, hoping it would help her forget her worries, even if just for a bit. As the evening started winding down, they hopped into the queue for the perilous plunge. It's quite a thrilling ride. Standing at 121 feet tall with a steep 75-degree drop, you end up splashing into a lake at the finish. Lori's kids hopped into a different boat, and she ended up sitting next to a stranger, the very last person to get on board. As we were riding along, the front of the boat lifted, and Lori found herself at the back of the boat. There was no seatbelt in it. She began to slide under the handrails, and just 33 feet from the lake, she tumbled out of the boat. Lori passed away instantly after hitting the water at a speed of 50 miles per hour. The investigation found that Lori's body shape didn't match the safety system's design, which did not prevent her from slipping under the handrails. Arntanaro Nelson. Arntanaro Nelson, who was 38 years old from Wilmington, stepped into a fenced area at Kings Island on June 22, 2024, in Ohio theme park. He took a brutal hit from the Banshee roller coaster and was found on the ground with a severe injury. He was rushed to the hospital, but sadly, he passed away the following day. Mason police reported that Nelson lost his keys while enjoying the Banshee, an inverted roller coaster where the train hangs from the rack. He went into the restricted area to retrieve his keys and ended up getting struck by the coaster. The Hamilton County's coroner's office has classified Nelson's death as a suspected accident, but the investigation is still ongoing. A park employee mentioned that the train was probably traveling around 70 miles per hour when it struck him. The Banshee was shut down after the incident, while the authorities and the park staff looked into what happened. After Nelson got hit, Kings Island put out a statement saying they were focused on the guests and his family's well-being, but didn't share any other details. Do you know that the Banshee is the longest steel inverted roller coaster in the world? According to the park's website, it can hit up to 68 miles per hour. It has a 176-foot lift hill and a 150-foot curved drop.